If you take a zoomed out look at the entire span of Big Wild's career, you'll quickly realize that he's one of the most perplexing artists that you've ever witnessed. Though it may not be as apparent if you only focus on where he is now. Every great musician draws inspiration from those that came before them, and Big Wild is no different. With his indie psychedelic vocal-driven sound, you would think that his early inspirations came from bands like maybe MGMT or maybe Empire of the Sun. But what if I told you that without the influence of heavyweight hip-hop producers like Dr. Dre and J Dilla, we may have never gotten the Big Wild project that we know and love today? To better understand the story of how Big Wild got to where he is today, we need to take a trip back in time. Jackson Stell was born on August 31st, 1990 in Lancaster, Massachusetts, which is where he spent his time growing up. He was your typical American 90s kid. He watched Seinfeld and he played Pokemon Red version on his Game Boy. He chose Bulbasaur as his starter, which I think is perfectly on brand for the Big Wild project. He also had big dreams of being a pro basketball player.
Like, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a professional basketball player. Like, that was my dream.
His family was full of musicians. His dad played guitar and sang in a few bands in college, and his mom has always been active in a choir. Even his grandmother sang with some big bands in the 30s and 40s. At a young age, he started taking piano lessons, but he admitted that he really hated it. He didn't really learn how to play the keys well until much later in life. It was something he kind of taught himself along the way when he was also learning to produce. He wanted a drum set, but his parents wouldn't get it for him because they said it would be too loud. His older brother played the trumpet, so he figured he would give that a go. He started in 3rd grade and played through 8th grade in his school's band, but he wasn't crazy about that either.
You know, I played like trumpet and piano before that, and music to me was interesting, but it was not something I'd be lying if I said like, as soon as I played that first note on piano, it was like love at first sound, you know? That's not how it worked. It was like, I actually really hated playing instruments.
When he was 13, he decided it was time to throw in the towel, and he picked up producing instead.
It started kind of like in 8th grade, middle school. I was just messing around with FL Studio, or Fruity Loops as it was called then, and then I was just kind of making hip-hop beats.
Finally, he had found an enjoyable way to express himself through music. In a 2016 interview with Vice, he said, "I like being the composer and having control over every sound, whereas with the trumpet and piano, I could only make those sounds, and I got tired of doing it all the time when I wanted to do something else." He would work on beats while simultaneously holding down a job for his friend's dad's landscaping company during his middle school summers. In his own words, "I was sweating my ass off digging up roots and trees." At 15 years old, after spending a couple of years learning his way around Fruity Loops, he began his endeavors as a hip-hop producer, hailing by the name of J Beatz.
J Beatz was like the coolest name in the world at the time.
He had been a huge fan of hip-hop nearly his whole life, and he paid particular attention to the producers. He drew major influence from guys like Dr. Dre, Swizz Beatz, Timbaland, J Dilla, and Pharrell. It didn't take him very long to decide that making beats is what he wanted to do for the rest of his life.
It was within like 6 months of doing that I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Make music. That's really cool. Which, like, when I think back at it, I was like, that's kind of ballsy to think that.
By the time he was in high school, he was making a little bit of money selling his beats on the internet. His overall experience as a producer growing up was pretty isolated. He wasn't involved in any sort of music scene, and he only had one other friend at school that was also producing. After graduating high school, he attended college at Northeastern University in Boston, where he studied music industry and took some additional music classes on the side.
Is a degree like that useless because it's so niche? Because I imagine you're only going to get out of it what you put into it, and it's really easy to fall through the cracks if you're not busting your ass.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, I would say it was pretty, like it hasn't really helped me much at all.
You know what? When I went to Northeastern and kind of throughout college, I kind of just kept to myself. I was kind of like the nerd in my dorm room working on music.
Although he mostly kept to himself, he did meet his wife Shamim at college, but they didn't get married until much later in 2021. In 2011, while Jackson was still in college, SoundCloud began popping off, and it caught his attention, giving him quite a revelation. He realized that he didn't need rappers to be on his beats. He could make music that could stand on its own, so in 2012, he started Big Wild. The name was inspired by a trip he took to Big Sur, California, because he was in awe of its beauty. He had never seen landscapes like that before.
Yeah, so I would say it was first inspired when I did my first trip to California. I'm from Massachusetts, and I visited Big Sur, and it was just such an incredible like change of landscape and everything that I was used to. And it just sparked something in me, like this kind of curious adventurousness, and I wanted a name that encapsulated that. So I borrowed from Big Sur and did Big Wild, and it's just supposed to be like being curious in life, being adventurous, you know, trying to be bold and take risks and do what you think you want to do, you know?
He began posting his beats online, named with just numbers, and they're still up on his SoundCloud to this day. You can hear the progress in each one, so it seems as if those tracks were practice for him to hone in his skills. Now, around this same time, he graduated from college and moved back home with his parents, and he got a day job producing jingles for an advertising agency. During his free time, he would work hard on making new tracks for the Big Wild project, and 2013 was the year that he really started to go hard. He dropped countless remixes, mini-mixes, and originals that year, and you could hear major progress from the tracks he had released the year before. Unfortunately, while he was making huge progress with his music, he had a major setback when he was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. In an interview, he said, "It felt like my death was moved from the recess of my mind and into the forefront." Understandably, his outlook on life was dramatically shifted. However, doctors were able to remove the cancer in early 2014 and he was cured. Which was great timing, by the way, because 2014 was about to be a monumental year in his life. His girlfriend Shamim was from the Bay Area in California, and she brought Jackson on a trip out there to convince him to move. He was totally on board and moved to San Francisco in April of that year, and he got a job at Whole Foods to support himself while working on music. He continued to crank out tunes on SoundCloud, including a collab with Troy Boy. What? You heard that right. Big Wild has a collab with Troy Boy. He also got tapped for an official Bro Safari remix and put out some other major tunes like Venice Venture, which his dad played the guitar on, and the track was actually inspired by Pulp Fiction. He even brought his dad out on stage to play the guitar live for Venice Venture in one of his early shows. Some other tracks that he released in 2014 included La Brisa, his remix of Sylvan Esso's Hey Mommy, and one of my personal favorites, his remix of When I Get Older by Wild Party. Oh, and let's not forget about Come We Go Part 2, which sounds like it could have been produced by RL Grime. Even with his big move to California and all of his major releases, he still had much more in store for 2014. It all started when Odesza hit up Big Wild on Twitter. They had discovered his music and wanted him to do a remix for their hit track, Say My Name. Obviously, he agreed, and the track was released later that year, but that's not even the crazy part of the story. Odesza was on tour and had 3 upcoming shows in California. Hayden James, who is from Australia, was supposed to be the opener for those shows, but due to some issues with his visa, he couldn't make it. Odesza needed to find a replacement, and they knew that Jackson was in San Francisco, so they asked him to fill in.
I was living in San Francisco, and they asked me, they're like, "You want to do these shows?" And I was like, sure. And that was the first, it was at the Mezzanine. And those were the first shows I'd ever really done, like as Big Wild, in front of people. So I was really nervous.
He played the 3 shows with them in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and Odesza's agent loved his performances, so he began representing Big Wild. Now that he had an agent, he was able to quit his job at Whole Foods because he started landing way more shows. He then moved to Venice Beach in Los Angeles and was asked by Odesza to go on tour with them for 2 months in early 2015. He accepted, and his girlfriend painted the front of his piano with some DMT fractal type looking art to give his sets a little bit of flair. Getting to see Odesza perform night after night allowed him to see what does and doesn't work in a live setting, which allowed him to improve his own performances. While he was on that tour, Clay and Harrison from Odesza were cooking up the idea to start their record label, Foreign Family Collective, and they asked Jackson if he wanted to release a track with them. He showed them one of his unreleased tracks, which we now know as After Gold, and they loved it and released it as the second ever Foreign Family release. The song was massive, and it landed a placement in one of the first ever Apple Watch commercials. His manager didn't even tell him about it until after it happened because he didn't want him to be let down if it didn't go through. And while we're talking about Odesza, they have actually made multiple tracks with Big Wild, but none of them have ever been played out or released. 2015 was such a major turning point for him for so many reasons, but ultimately it was because it was his first full year living as a full-time professional artist. For the remainder of the year, he went on tours with Kodak to Graph, Grammatic, and GRiZ, got major festival bookings like Shambhala and Sewanee Halloween, and even got to play his first headline show in Austin, Texas. Speaking of GRiZ, Big Wild actually collaborated with him years ago, but the track never got released. In 2015, he released more massive tracks like his remix of GRiZ's song For the Love and a remix of 100 Waters' Show Me. That one is listed as an original featuring 100 Waters because they worked out the publishing for that, but technically it is a remix. Jaden Smith actually played that song on his Beats Radio 1 show in 2016. Big Wild has said in interviews that Show Me is his favorite remix. He looks back on the time making that song very fondly. He remembers working on it while touring and also getting to see the Pacific Northwest for the first time. In 2015, Big Wild also released his Goodies playlist on SoundCloud, which features mashups that he used in his early shows. If you're an OG Big Wild fan, then you definitely know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't heard them, then you need to go check those out ASAP.
How you ain't gon' fuck? Bitch, I'm me. I'm the goddamn reason you in VIP. CEO, you don't have to CID. I'm young, wild, and strapped like G.I.
I want to take a moment to talk about Big Wild's live performances in this specific era of his career because it's dramatically different from how he performs today. For the first few years of his performances, his setup consisted of a keyboard, MIDI drum pad, Ableton Push to trigger clips in Ableton Live, a cajon, and a microphone used specifically for the whistling section of his Hey Mommy remix. He was basically a one-man band, which was a major advantage for him because no one else was really doing that at the time. At least not the exact way that he was doing it. His sets were very percussion-oriented, and funny enough, he didn't ever really drum before actually performing live. He would stay very engaged for the whole set because he always had something to do, and it also gave fans something interesting to pay attention to. One of the most exciting moments during his sets was whenever he would bust out his cajon and start slapping out a rhythm. Now, by 2016, his unique performances and music had caught the attention of enough of the world that it was time for him to embark on his first headline tour. Alongside the debut of his spring tour, he re-released After Gold, but this time it featured vocalist Tova Stierke singing a top line over the instrumental. He also dropped his spring 2016 mix, which debuted a bunch of unreleased tracks. After he wrapped up his headline tour, he went on a tour with Tycho, and he also did a handful of shows with Zeds Dead and Pretty Lights. He also got to play Red Rocks for the first time when he opened for Odesza that year. He also played the first ever Okeechobee Music Festival, and he actually has a hilarious story about that. Here's what he said. One time when I was on stage at Okeechobee Music Fest, it was the first year they did it. I was on the beach stage and it was the very first day. I don't think the festival expected as many people to come as did, so my crowd was huge. So far back for a tiny little stage. There was no security at all and people were climbing on stage, dancing, doing whatever whatever they wanted. It got really rowdy. So I was doing something on the drums, and I turn around to trigger something on my controller, and I see this person out of the corner of my eye just standing very close to me. I was immediately like, whoa, I had no idea he was there. You could tell he was on something, but he had a big smile on his face and he put his arms out, so I hugged him and we had a little moment on stage, and then he peacefully walked off the stage. So I tried really hard to find that video. I looked all over the internet, and I even made a post on Reddit asking if anyone had it, but unfortunately I came up short, so the story is all we have. Now, as for the rest of his 2016 releases, he dropped his remix of Church's Empty Threat, which was one of the unreleased tracks that was debuted in the spring mix. He also dropped Invincible with Ida Hawk on Foreign Family, which was the lead single off of his upcoming debut EP. That song actually landed him his second Apple commercial placement. This time, it was for the Apple Watch 3. In 2016, Jackson also moved once again, this time to Santa Cruz. At this point, he was more established as an artist, and he didn't really need Los Angeles for networking anymore, and he wanted to move somewhere that was a little bit more laid back. In February of 2017, he released his debut EP on Foreign Family Collective, the Invincible EP. This EP marked a significant change for Big Wild, as it was the first time that he dove headfirst into singing and songwriting. Crickets was the first track that he sang on, and he also wrote the lyrics for it, as well as the lyrics and melody for Empty Room. He also worked closely with Ida Hawk on writing Invincible. The EP was a pivot from his old style that would take him in the musical direction that Superdream was birthed from, but we'll get into that later. As for the rest of 2017, he went on another headline tour, played more festivals, and he got to play Red Rocks again, this time with Big Gigantic. He also released his remix of Gallant's song, Talking to Myself. In 2018, he returned to Red Rocks as a co-headliner with Louis the Child, played EDC Las Vegas, played Okeechobee for the second time, as well as countless other shows and festivals. He also put out more of his show tracks on SoundCloud, including a remix of Father Stretch My Hands, and his original track called Going, which was one of the unreleased tracks in his spring 2016 mix. He also released his track called Ascension on Foreign Family Collective, and something interesting about that track is that one of the lead sounds is actually a sample of an elephant blowing air through its trunk. In November of 2018, Big Wild released Joy Punks and Maker off of his upcoming Superdream album, and he released the track Heaven a month later. He said that Joy Punks was an ode to Daft Punk, hence the punks part of the name, and another interesting thing about that song is that the vocal chops were actually taken from his song City of Sound. Maker was written about his experience with thyroid cancer and the feeling of having a new lease on life after he was cured. 2018 was also the year that he moved once again, leaving Santa Cruz for Portland, where he has been living ever since. His debut album Superdream was finally released in February of 2019 and received plenty of praise from fans. The album was a full-blown shift into what we got a glimpse of from the Invincible EP. Many of the tracks are crafted around Jackson's own vocals and songwriting. When he made the decision to start singing on tracks, it was because he felt that it would be the best way to fully express himself and get his message across.
I think the biggest thing I was communicating was just showing people who I am. When I was writing these songs, I wanted them all based off my own experiences and things that really I've gone through myself, and it was just sharing with people more of who I am, which diving into more vocals and diving into songwriting was like something I felt I needed to do. Is like, this is who I am, and I couldn't really always do that with just instrumental music, so it's kind of like a big step for me in terms of just putting myself out there.
He never really sang before this album, other than his song Crickets, and his whole family was shocked by him singing. Before he made the album, he needed to learn the basics of singing and vocal control, so he took lessons from Shamim's old choir teacher.
Well, when I was first starting, I just really needed to learn any kind of technique. I'd never really sung seriously in my life, ever. And it was really daunting, and I connected my Shamim, my partner. She told me about she did choir in high school, And so I ended up getting lessons from her old choir teacher who's an amazing teacher, and he taught me the basics. Because I want to go into it just like knowing the fundamentals of how to sing, and then like learning about my voice and everything from there.
Superdream featured massive songs such as Sixes to Nines with Rationale and Alley Oop with Idahawk. There's even a song named after his pet bunny Mopsy called Mopsy's Interlude. Big Wild recorded the album in a makeshift studio that he had set up in his laundry room, and Mopsy has an outdoor pin that could be seen from one of the windows. So when he was finishing up the track, Shamim walked into the studio and immediately thought the song was about Mopsy, which is why he named it Mopsy's Interlude. His makeshift studio had terrible acoustics, so he bought a Japanese bamboo door from a thrift store and threw blankets over it to make a vocal booth. The room also didn't have any heat, so he had to layer up every time that he would go in there to record, and he had to take his computer and microphone out every night just to make sure that they didn't get too cold and break. It just goes to show that you could make a wildly popular album without an expensive setup. After the album dropped, he embarked on his Superdream tour, which featured a brand new live show that was dramatically different from his previous shows. He entered into a new era of Big Wild, ditching the old one-man band performances in favor of a real band.
Having other players on stage has always been something I've wanted to do. With Superdream, I finally felt I had a body of work that would work with other players on stage.
Jackson was still doing much of what he did in the one-man band days, except this time he was singing way more and he had backup singers and instrumentalists. The band included Haley Johnson on bass and vocals, Maddie Rice on guitar and vocals, and Idahawk on vocals. They embarked on a headline tour for most of the year, and they performed one night at Red Rocks. On Halloween that year, while performing in Nashville, they appeared as Wig Wild for one night only, with each of the band members sporting bright neon wigs. Once everything shut down due to COVID in 2020, Jackson had a lot of free time at home. It gave him time to work on his next album, but also 2 new singles which he dropped that year, Touch and Who Do You Believe? He wrote Touch about times when he was away from Shamim on tour. In an interview, he said, "That yearning can become almost torturous and drive me mad. I dove deep into that emotion and out came Touch." Who Do You Believe was written about the craziness of the modern information age, especially when it seemed to be at an all-time high in 2020. It's about the growing divisiveness that's caused by the mass media with the spreading of false narratives and misinformation. I think it's one of the most powerful songs in his discography and possibly the most culturally relevant. Speaking about the song in an interview, he said, "The hope is that the song serves as a starting point for people to take a look at where we're at as a nation and how in a certain sense we're all complicit in this self-aggrandizing culture. Then the hope is to take that realization and grow from it, to arrive at a place where we're thinking critically for ourselves and not just blindly consuming and believing what the media and people/positions of power are stating as truth. We need to do our own due diligence and decipher fact versus fiction, as well as respect each other as people in this politically charged time." The track was released with a visually stunning music video, which was co-directed by his wife. Speaking on the video, Jackson said, "It was important to release the song with the music video to visualize the different components of the song, like the media, the people reacting to information and news, and the powerful voices and commentators who seek to divide us." The music video closes out with a simple but striking message: "Welcome to our world of technology." In 2021, things started to go back to normal, and Big Wild was back to playing major shows like Lollapalooza and another Red Rocks headline show. He also released Awaken, Feel Alive, which featured a top line from Surfaces over his Awaken track from Superdream. In his free time, he started gardening at his house in Portland as he took up an interest in fostering natural biodiversity. On September 18th of 2021, he and Shamim finally tied the knot, getting married in Portland. In 2022, he headlined Red Rocks once again, debuting new music from his upcoming sophomore album, The Efferusphere. He was also featured as a vocalist on Corey Wong's track Crisis, and he also released a collaboration with fellow Foreign Family artist Phantoms with the track Fire Pit. He also began his rollout of his new album by releasing 4 singles: Feel Good, Red Sun, OM Garden, and Blue. His bunny Mopsy got the spotlight once again with the music video for OM Garden. It's an animated video centered around Mopsy exploring the garden in Jackson and Shamim's backyard, and it's absolutely adorable. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely check it out. On September 9th of 2022, the Efferusphere was finally released. It featured a distinct evolution of Big Wild's sound, both instrumentally and vocally. This album really stuck out to me because it was a huge departure from the old school Big Wild sounds of the mid-2010s, and it was still a moderate departure from Superdream. I actually had the chance to speak with Jackson at a GRiZ show back in 2015, and he told me that he was listening to a lot of Tame Impala at the time because Currents had just been released. When I was doing research for this video, I noticed that he said in probably 20 or 25 different interviews over the years that he was inspired by Tame Impala. When the Efferusphere finally dropped, I was immediately taken back to our conversation because the album certainly sounds like it has Tame Impala influences. The organic drums, the psychedelic guitars and vocals, and the heavy use of flanger. Not to mention, Big Wild and Tame Impala now share the commonality that they are both one-man producers, but they perform live as a band. To me, it felt like this was a transition that Jackson probably had on his mind for a very long time, and we finally got to see it come to fruition. And the exciting part is that this is only the beginning, and I'm excited to see how he pushes this sound moving forward. He went on a headline tour for the album that spanned from 2022 to 2023, and he played Red Rocks once again this year. The new show also featured new band members. Haley Johnson is the only remaining member from the Superdream era band, and she still plays the bass and sings. The two new band members are Tracy Lambertucci, who plays guitar, and Madden Class, who plays the drums. Some of his other major performances this year included Coachella, Bonnaroo, and Lollapalooza, among many others. We recently got a new Big Wild remix, something we haven't seen from him in quite some time. He remixed Group Love's track Hello, and it honestly might be my favorite remix ever from him. I'm also a huge fan of both Group Love and Big Wild, so for me it was a match made in heaven, so I might be a little biased. As for upcoming plans for Big Wild, he has a handful of festivals in the near future, but beyond that, the rest is a mystery. It's pretty wild to think that someone with early ambitions of being a hip-hop producer ended up being a psychedelic rocker, but once you understand the full story of Big Wild, it makes perfect sense. A lot of artists like to hide the music from their past once they make such major stylistic shifts, but Big Wild isn't like that. He's proud of where he's been and where he's going, and his catalog of music serves as public record of that. Personally, I love every era of Big Wild, and I love that I'm able to revisit each one as I please. His older music gives context to his newer music in a way that deepens the way we experience it, and I think that's one of the most unique aspects of the project.
Moving forward, I'm gonna take everything I've learned, but at the end of the day, I'm gonna follow the same guiding light I've used the whole time, which is don't shy away from making what I wanna make. Stay curious, be adventurous, be genuine. What I do in the future, I don't necessarily know. I just know that those principles are going to guide me wherever I go.